I want to talk about what's going on with NIL enforcement. You may have seen the headlines that the NCAA is going to be using some former FBI and CIA people to start really looking into more NIL violation claims and cracking down. And for that part of it, I don't see anything wrong with that. Okay. Because, if you look, for example, the highest profile case of NIL misconduct, I would say is whoever you blame for it, whether you blame, I don't blame the player and his family, but if whoever you blame for the Jaden Rashada saga, if you try to blame Jaden or if you blame Florida or the Gator Collective or the lawyers that were involved with this, whoever you have to blame for it, we can all agree when you promise someone $13 million and then you suddenly just say, hey, by the way, we can't pay it, that's a problem. Like that was a high profile failure of name, image, and likeness. And I think that's been the big catalyst here that has prompted the NCAA into beefing up their enforcement. And to me, like, you want to add CIA people and FBI people, I see nothing wrong with that. But here's something I think that could devolve into a pretty awful situation with the way NIL is enforced. So, the NCAA Vice President of Enforcement, John Duncan, he spoke in front of a crowd of administrators at the NCAA's annual convention recently. This is from Sports Illustrated, by the way, is where this story comes from, this summary of what Mr. Duncan said. So they write at SI, the NCAA and enforcement staff will no longer be hamstrung by uncooperative witnesses when it comes to potential NIL violations, thanks to a new bylaw that goes into effect, that went into effect January 1st. So this has been in effect for a month. And here's what I don't like, because honestly, and I know the NCAA, it's not an arm of the government, but this sounds downright un-American to me. Okay. Investigators can now use circumstantial evidence like a tip or a news story instead of on-record sourcing to presume a school violated NCAA rules. So that's now a presumption of guilt. Okay. Schools can disprove the allegations or else be potentially charged. The move strengthens the enforcement staff's ability to charge schools, and allows more leeway for investigators. Quote, if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's a duck, Duncan said. Instead of putting the burden on the enforcement staff to always come up with a smoking gun, which we don't always have, there is a presumption, he says. It puts the burden on the school. It's a really powerful tool. No kidding, it's powerful. I mean, it sounds like a dictatorship is what it sounds like here. No kidding, that's a powerful tool when you can now use a tip or a news story as evidence of impropriety. And then you now, instead of presuming innocence, you presume guilt when you investigate. Here's what's scary about that, folks. Imagine how many anonymous tips and rumors they're going to start getting flooded with, right? They're now going to and of course, it's their job to filter out the serious complaints from the unserious complaints. That's easier said than done, because suddenly you get flooded by vengeful complaints from rival schools or even rival fans and administrators. That's going to have the NCAA running around like a headless chicken trying to look into all this stuff. And then how do we trust them to actually decide which schools to look into and which not to look into? Because, folks, I guarantee you there are going to be biases at play here, because they're going to be getting allegations left and right and center, and they're going to have to decide which ones to look into first and maybe which ones they don't have the time or resources to look into at all, because their resources are not unlimited, right? So I can imagine that the NCAA phones are already ringing off the hook with Gator fans just begging them to look into John Ruiz, right? When the Gators fans should probably be more worried about the reptile looking at them in the mirror right now than John Ruiz. And I'm sure, listen, if John Ruiz were here right now, I am sure he would say, go ahead and look into everything we're doing because I have nothing to hide, right? And to this point, it sure does look like Ruiz does everything by the book. You may not like how the book is written, but Ruiz does it by the book, dotting every I, crossing every T, and apparently paying every cent that he promises to pay. No $13 million promises that went unpaid with him. And listen, I genuinely hope that these new NIL bylaws can prevent something like the Jaden Rashada situation from ever happening again. And I hope it makes NIL better, right? Just my fear is that this just opens up a slippery slope for witch hunts and even lawsuits that are going to come as a result of this that are only going to make things worse, not better. I hope that's not the case because, yeah, we've seen, folks, plenty of evidence over the years of the NCAA conducting biased and improper investigations. So if we haven't been able to trust the NCAA to enforce their own rules up to this point over the past 40 years, why should we trust them now? Okay. So that's what I'm afraid of when it comes to NCAA enforcement. And I think we all can agree they didn't have a game plan for this when it first came about. They're playing catch up now. But is this too much of a corrective measure? Right? If opening yourselves up to tip lines and anonymous complaints and presumptions of guilt, it makes me very concerned that this is what's going to be the thing that fixes the problem, right? Fingers crossed. Fingers crossed this goes smoothly and leads to better times